Welcome to episode 14 of the YoJoeShow Podcast. Let's start with some Part 1.
So far, as of this recording, is that at least 12 people were killed, including 3 children, and more than 60 were injured as missiles and drones rained down all across Ukraine, far from the front.
They may have actually been assembled within Russia, but the same parts that they order from China and they build these FPV drones and then they attack these bombs, their range is very limited. So what they did is they put these in these pallets, in these containers, and they had regular Russian trucking companies ship these to areas not far from Air Force bases. And then they use these drones to completely destroy and obliterate probably about 41 heavy bombs.
Elon and I had a great relationship. I don't know if we will anymore, but I'm very disappointed in Elon. I've helped Elon a lot. And I'll be honest, I think he misses the place. I think he got out there and all of a sudden he wasn't in this beautiful Oval Office.
The lowest blows came from Elon's side when he posted, "Without me, Trump would have lost the election. Dems would control the House and the Republicans would be 51-49 in the Senate." And then this one, time to drop the really big bomb. Donald Trump is in the Epstein files. That is the real reason they have not been made public. Have a nice day, DJT. The president shot back. Elon was wearing thin. I asked him to leave. I took away his EV mandate that forced everyone to buy electric cars that nobody else wanted, that he knew for months I was going to do. And he just went crazy. Democratic lawmakers are claiming they called it.
Continue to work independently of the CIA, independently of the government, and there must have been some people that knew this was still happening. They had a base here in Florida, and they apparently RFK actually sent helicopters, military helicopters, to bomb out or firebomb the location so that it couldn't keep operating. They're like, you guys can't be there. We're going to destroy the thing. And yet they still continued. And then that group viewed this as treason, that basically that JFK was acting in a treasonous manner. They didn't have the interest of the country, and he should be fighting Cuba, and he should be fighting Russia or USSR, and therefore he needs to be taken out.
You could have stopped that!
How did you know this was happening?
Reddit.
And, like I said many times, these elected officials or these non-government organizations, they can't cross the line either. I mean, we got...
What he has to say.
Never recovered from finding out that the food pyramid was a scam.
Yeah.
That was just the degree to which that's a scam is, I don't know, is there a worse medical crime in history than that? No.
Telling Americans to load up on 7 to 11 servings of grains every single day.
Yeah. To find out that was a marketing ploy by the Department of Agriculture and that they went against the advice even of their own consultants who warned them that they would produce an epidemic of obesity and diabetes, which is, and not to say nothing of depression and dementia, which is exactly what we have now.
Exactly.
I don't know what you even do when you find out that's true.
And the unwarranted demonization of natural fat-containing foods, nutrient-dense foods like animal-source foods, which continue to be demonized.
Even by the American Diabetic, is it Association Society? I don't remember which one is still pushing the notion that diabetics can eat carbohydrates. Actually, I don't think so. I don't think that's a very good idea, since they're converted to sugar.
That's the crux of all this. And if you notice, there's a theme throughout this episode. This has to do with all the behind-the-scenes things with governments, whether it's a government in the Ukraine or Russia, or are they really working in the interest of the people? That's really the question. And it's a tremendous scam. Most doctors, in fact, one of the things that Bobby Jr., so RFK Jr. mentioned this past week was that he's considering making it a requirement that medical schools start teaching nutrition. And if they don't, perhaps a year from now, they will stop receiving federal funding. Because
using the same tactics they use to promote tobacco, food companies set about peddling the entire planet a diet of processed goods, loaded with chemicals and additives, masquerading.
The potential for social control is gigantic and potentially irreversible.
Yeah, it is irreversible and it is very scary. Like you mentioned earlier with the social credit in China, basically, if you do something and you get a bad social credit, maybe it could be littering, maybe it could be having a bad opinion about the government or anything like that, you can be shut off from everything, from banking, from purchasing anything online, purchasing anything using your digital wallet, which in China is basically your only wallet. Even when you cross the street, there could be like these signs that basically shame you because you have a low social credit score. So this is something that's very terrifying.
Here we are at the newly incorporated Starbase, Texas. This is the first new city made in America in, I think, quite a few decades. At least that's what I'm told. And a very cool name. And it's named that because it is where we're going to develop the technology necessary to take humanity and civilization and life as we know it to another planet for the first time in the 4.5 billion year history of Earth. It comes back in about 5 or 6 minutes, one way or another, and then it gets caught by the tower arms, placed back in the launch mount, and then you can refill propellant in about 30 to 40 minutes and place a ship on top of it, and in principle, refly the entire booster every hour. Transfer, how you do orbital transfer from Earth to Mars. And if you look on your Starlink Wi-Fi router, you'll see this image, because the Starlink Wi-Fi is or Starlink Internet is what's being used to pay for humanity getting to Mars, or the landing pads, just in case. But for Mars, we're going to need a lot of solar power. Since you can't really walk around on the surface of Mars, at least as yet, until Mars is terraformed to be like Earth.
Yeah, so that really is the grand vision, is to basically have a sister planet that could support life.
Why is the dog driving your car? It's a driverless car. Balthazar just likes the front seat. Of course, and he can control the stereo. There you go. There is literally nothing we can do, so have a nice day. Future really sneaks up on you, huh?
That's actually great. I haven't seen that before. It's very cute.
The future really. So for those that didn't see it, it's animal control is stopped in traffic and sees a car go by with a dog apparently driving the car. So they're like, we got to pull this guy over. And
That's
like,
notably.
That's why they said, that's why we need sirens. So they pull him over, and it's a dog in the seat. And the guy says, there's a man next to him. He says, here's my driver's license. And why is your dog driving? It's a self-driving car. Of course, he's driving a Tesla.
Can't believe this twist. So grab your popcorn, pull up a chair. It's Elon versus Donald, who's got better hair. When rockets and rallies just aren't enough, they settle their scores with childish stuff.
All right, now let's join Yo and Joe for all this and much, much more in episode 14.
Hey, everyone, and welcome to the YoJoeShow Podcast. Hey, Joe, how's this week been doing?
Week's doing great. A lot of things in the news, but on my end, heart's beating, lungs are working. I know not to complain too much. How you been doing?
Yeah, I'm awake and alive, and given we started to record in the mornings earlier, it's definitely a lot easier to stay awake and stay focused and sharp. But yeah, this week was interesting. Obviously, the notable billionaire feud we will be discussing in depth towards the end of this podcast. But beforehand, there are some military techniques and tactics that have been developing over the battlefields of Ukraine for the past few years that we want to touch upon, and then a few other interesting topics, JFK files, and a little bit about health and AI. Yeah, why don't we get started?
Absolutely. And I think that we try to blend in some of the current topics and some of the things that perhaps are just topics we want to cover.
Exactly. And some we've been meaning to cover for the past few weeks.
This first clip is from Preston Stewart, one of our favorites regarding military reporting. He always does such an amazing job. This is a short piece of one of the posts that he did recently.
Rolling out a drone wall that'll create a kill zone 50 kilometers deep all across the front. And Russia isn't very happy about this. They're saying that if this actually comes to fruition, it could effectively stop any future advance. So let's get into what this looks like from a Russian perspective. Mind you, we'll look at some Ukrainian sources here as well, but I thought to really understand the effectiveness and what this could mean on the battlefield, it's best to look at it from Russia's point of view and how much they absolutely hate this idea and arguably are doing everything they can to try to stop it, including the targeting of Ukrainian drone manufacturing facilities all across the country. So this drone line, as it's being called, are essentially kill zones broken out across 50-kilometer deep area of the front, and is broken out into sectors here. They say 0 to 5 kilometers total clearing. Everything is mined, so landmines on the ground. Buildings and shelters are destroyed. Neither infantry nor equipment will pass. Think of that as a dead zone, right?
Forces.
10 to 15 kilometers, elimination of enemy artillery, and 20 to 50 kilometers, strikes on rear facilities, air defense.
Yeah, so when this war began, it's funny. It started as an all-out assault by Russia on Kiev, trying to topple the Zelensky regime. while intensely invading from Crimea, both to the west and to the east. And then in the Donetsk and Luhansk areas, they tried to increase the battles that have already been going on there. But it started, Russia tried to drop special forces near an airport in Kiev, and they actually took control of that for a little while. And then over the years, as the war slowed down, it really started to revert basically to like World War One style warfare. So lots of trenches, lots and lots of artillery and stuff like that. Over the time, obviously, drones started to increase in value. We saw when Russia partnered with Iran to start using the Shahed drones and then started to build manufacturer plants there. Obviously, Ukraine was using the TB2s, the Bayraktars, which are Turkish, which were extremely effective at the beginning of the war. But over time, those larger drones started to lose effect towards much smaller and more advanced drone warfare, specifically FPV drones. So FPV is first person view. So you wear like VR goggles and the pilots are able to control these drones. Their distance is very limited. Originally, they were using remote communication, but that started being defeated by electronic warfare measures. So what now they're mostly doing is they're using fiber optic wires, which are tiny, super thin glass wires that the drone basically drags behind it. So that way it can't be jammed by enemy jammers. Both sides are using this. Specifically, Ukraine has been mastering these FPV attack drones, and people think they order these from the United States. The United States basically doesn't have any of these at any large scale. The vast majority of this innovation is actually Ukrainian. So they've been ordering these parts from China, and then they assemble these attack drones. And they're great at bombing artillery, bombing tanks, bombing humans. You can have different types of charged cluster munitions, etc. And the idea now is because there are so many of these basically drone workshops in Ukraine, and they actually started like this prize system. So Ukrainian units get a prize for everything that they verifiably kill. So for every human, there's a point. For every tank, for every armored division, etc. They have these different point systems, and then they can use these points to buy newer drones. And all these defense manufacturers, basically, which are really just like basement workshops, they've been improving at an extremely rapidly pace because there's this real competition and there's this real free market where the units can choose what they want to purchase using these points, and these manufacturers can all compete against each other. So the innovation has been huge, and currently they're probably at the very forefront of the world when it comes to this drone warfare. Again, the United States has lots of very capable, very powerful Predator and other drones, Reaper drones, etc. But these are far more useful in terms of basically very specific for exactly what you need. And if you can manufacture these in the millions, you can create these virtual walls, essentially, preferably within the enemy territory, but it is more beneficial when on defense than when on offense, to basically like a no clear zone. So suddenly the trenches are barely used anymore. Suddenly artillery, both sides ran out of them, and the West kind of wasn't able to ramp up manufacturing at any decent pace. And Russia still manufactures a lot, but like we saw in that clip, if Ukraine is bombing all of their artillery shells within all their artillery guns within 20, 30 miles, then their artillery isn't within range to be useful anymore. So the war has really adapted. Russia, to their credit, we should say, has been ramping up the manufacturing of these Iranian Shaheds, but they've also been improving the technology on them really drastically. But those are larger drones and they're less maneuverable. Obviously, what we've been seeing is a lot of defense, right? Nets and stuff like that. But with these little drones, they can go around and find an opening and go into the trench and find the people, and boom. So it is a brand new form of warfare, and it's, although gory, it is very fascinating to watch the developments in this field. How have you been keeping track, and what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, from a technological standpoint, it is interesting, and certainly have an interest in drone technology, not specifically for military use. However, remember, while these drones are flying, you don't have fighter pilots, you don't have you're reducing some casualties and some risk that's being put on whoever is sending these drones up. But I think the other side of the conversation is, despite the view of technology and its role, there's been calls for de-escalation and for the firing and the bombing to stop altogether. At the end of the day, people are being killed that really have no need to be killed on both sides. Right. So these governments, no matter what justification they have, at this point, whether you consider it a territorial dispute, whether you consider it to be the concern that Russia has regarding NATO membership of other countries and so forth, who's paying the price? It's the people. And there's a lot of money flowing around. There's a lot of money disappearing. And the U.S. government has said specifically that it wants to do whatever needs to be done to stop the killing, period. And this isn't just a game where we could send drones up to bomb other people or other equipment. So ultimately, that's the side of the conversation I've been following. And sure enough, despite these calls for calmness and some negotiations to occur, what happened? Even though there was talk of this wall of drones and the drone technology, the next clip is actually Kyiv burning after Russia bombed them. So I think we should put that up, and then because that's what escalated the things further and led to where we are right now and what potentially can happen. So this next clip is in the Ukraine after an attack from Russia.
Be taking a weekend off, but the war continues. This cannot be ignored. America's silence, the silence of others in the world, only encourages Vladimir Putin. Pretty powerful words there from Ukrainian President Zelensky following one of the largest missile and drone attacks carried out by Russia into Ukraine overnight. Now, what we know so far as of this recording is that at least 12 people were killed, including 3 children, and more than 60 were injured as missiles and drones rained down all across Ukraine, far from the front, mind you. Now, just the attack last night, our understanding is that 60 KH version cruise missiles were used, as well as 9 Iskander ballistic missiles and 300 Shahed-style drones, the Shahed or Garand-style drones. Ukraine says that they were able to shoot down 47 of those cruise missiles and 266 Shahed, shot down and or crashed somewhere away from population centers. So just looking at those numbers, you expect that there's going to be pretty significant damage to the targets in Ukraine or the areas near.
Yeah, and just to clarify, we will be discussing the Spiderweb attacks in just a few minutes and the retaliation to this, but this is what preceded that, right? So we've been having these kind of endless rounds of escalation, of course.
And yes, this video is from about a week ago, but it's just to put things in perspective. A week doesn't go by that something is being bombed or something is happening. And the bottom line is, if what Zelensky said is true, ultimately, words are words. If each side continues lobbing missiles at each other or drones or what have you. I think, again, from my perspective, the concern is still, this needs to stop. I think each side is trying to see how much they can sneak in another attack or do whatever, but it's not the answer. Ultimately, it still has the same end result for the people who, if you ask them, they'll probably admit that they don't want to have drones, bombs, or other things falling on their heads. And there's the statement made by President Trump on Vladimir Putin basically, I think, points that out. I can put that up and we can talk a little bit about that. Obviously, he was frustrated that he's calling for negotiations and peace, and then this happened. And then so Trump then went and made a public statement on Truth Social, and ultimately this is, we'll put up the statement. I think that's my focus, is really, what are these people, what are these leaders doing? We need to just stop this. That's ultimately the goal, right?
Yeah, so let's take a look, and then I do have some opinions.
So it basically says, this is President Trump saying, I've always had a very good relationship with Vladimir Putin of Russia, but something has happened to him. He's gone absolutely crazy in capitals. He's needlessly killing a lot of people, and I'm not just talking about soldiers. Missiles, drones are being shot into cities in Ukraine for no reason whatsoever. I've always said he wants all of Ukraine, not just a piece of it. And maybe that's proving to be right. But if he does, it will lead to the downfall of Russia, ! Likewise, President Zelensky is doing his country no favors by talking the way he does. Everything out of his mouth causes problems. I don't like it, and it better stop. This is a war that would have never happened if I were president. This is Zelensky's and Putin's war and Biden's war, and not Trump's. I'm only helping to put out the big, ugly fires that have been started through gross incompetence and hatred.
So what I would say to that is, good morning, President Trump. And the reason is, although the wish for the war to end rapidly is, I think, agreed upon by all, and even the understanding that this trench warfare can't continue forever, especially when it was in its trench phase. Now that it's developed beyond that and it's more in its kind of high-tech drone phase, it seems like things are moving a little bit quicker. Both sides are a little bit less likely to try and rush for a ceasefire. But really, when it was in its trench kind of World War I style warfare, where it's just endless death and the line doesn't move in any direction whatsoever, that's the will to end the war is admirable by all, right? And all the efforts that Trump and Vance and everybody else have put in to try and get this war ended are appreciated by all. But also, it is very important to emphasize that obviously Ukraine didn't choose this war, and corruption aside, we can discuss that, and we all agree that there's a lot of corruption on both sides, including on the Ukrainian side. But over the years, and especially with all of these Trump's attempts at ceasefires, basically Zelensky, for as much rhetoric he had to suffer from Trump, he basically agreed to every single one of Trump's offers time and time again. And then the Russians, every single time, would say, okay, we're okay with that, but, and then they would add this whole list of additional requirements. This has happened probably about 16 times in a row now, right? So for people keeping track of Russia, and it's funny, the whole argument that this is just about keeping a country on Russia's border away from NATO, that kind of failed colossally when Sweden and Norway joined NATO, and they have larger borders with NATO almost than Ukraine, and with Russia than Ukraine. So and these are humongous countries and very powerful. So if he didn't want NATO on his border, now he's got them on his border. So that backshot, that's for sure. But even in terms of, Zelensky has basically said yes every single time to these ceasefires, and then the Kremlin basically adds demands. Or we even saw Trump was willing to fly to Istanbul and meet with Zelensky and with Putin, and Zelensky was on his way to fly there too, and then Putin backed out, and then Trump canceled his flight to there as well because he wanted to meet them. So it has been the Russians almost repeatedly, every single time that something is agreed upon, and the Americans basically force the Ukrainians into agreement, the Russians just add more things to the list of what they want. And their demands are like irrational, right? No buffer zone, no international forces to keep the peace. Ukraine can't rearm during any ceasefires, which is like, what would Russia be doing during a ceasefire, right? So Russia's almost acting as if Ukraine are the aggressors, as if Ukraine invaded Russia, and that did happen on the Kursk part. But that is not what this war is about, right? So a lot of these Russian demands are completely absurd, and they're just very unrealistic, right? They want Ukraine to cease all recruitment of military soldiers during any ceasefire, but you will continue recruiting, and then you're going to continue the invasion, right? To be honest, for a very long time, I was very hopeful with these ceasefire negotiations that they would go somewhere, but I was extremely skeptical because, especially as Russia was making progress, finally, even though it was incremental, like a foot by foot progress with tens of thousands of dead, and Russia really doesn't give a shit about its people dying, its soldiers dying. It literally sends them straight to the front lines, especially when they come from rural parts of Russia, which have been utterly decimated. So like the Moscow elite, they're still living a pretty decent life in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but everybody from the rural parts of Russia, basically there's not a single man standing or walking, because they have all been sent to the front and murdered, basically killed, because they were sent many times with no training, no preparation. It improved after the beginning of the war, but it still wasn't very good. And we've seen that with the attacks too, where Ukraine in general does try to very much focus their attacks on hitting high quality military targets. Russia does have the sense of striking fear into the heart of the Ukrainian population, and therefore repeatedly they've been bombing civilians. So when Trump finally says, hey, Putin is crazy, it's important to realize that this is after basically 2 years of pressuring Zelensky, even though Zelensky was agreeing to every single one of the United States' demands almost. And even though Putin was basically saying no every single time, at least publicly, Putin didn't get any backlash. Now, it could be that behind closed doors, Trump was pressuring Putin very strongly. We don't really know that, but at least publicly, Trump has been bashing Zelensky nonstop, and including in the Oval Office, and there are different reasons for that, like we discussed in the past. But when it comes to pressure on Putin, that didn't happen at all from the Trump campaign, at all. And this is the very first instance where we're seeing that. So let's continue on with this topic, because there is more and further developments, and we'll continue this discussion as we move along.
Yeah, I'll just say that I'm not a fan of either leader at all. And that, listen, the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and there were, subsequent to that and preceding that, there was a lot of talk. Even if it wasn't formalized, James Baker did basically make these statements about how NATO wouldn't progress beyond the borders of Germany. And you made the point, which backs up President Putin's concerns. Okay, these were commitments being made by the United States and saying, look, you guys do this, we'll do that, we'll help keep countries from being on your doorstep that are all part of NATO. And I don't view this as being unimportant. And I don't view this as being an excuse. And you're right, it might have backfired, but it's not a good thing when you, on a handshake, say we're not going to do something as a country, and then we're allowing or encouraging things to happen. So I don't think one side is right. Sides are wrong, I think. That's the better way to look at it. And in the end, just like Preston Stewart says, at the end, people are the ones that are suffering.
That's definitely correct. It is important to remember the Budapest Memorandum, because if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, Ukraine was at the forefront of Soviet industrial production, including military industrial production. So a lot of the most advanced factors for the Tupolevs and the Sukhois, the jets, the engines were manufactured in Ukraine, and a lot of the nuclear reactors were in Ukraine. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, during the Budapest Memorandum, it was agreed and signed by the UK, the United States, and Russia that if Ukraine gives up its nukes, then that these countries would basically defend them. It wasn't like a defense pact, but it was a memorandum. And then obviously Russia invaded them, and at least the United States sold them weapons and gave them weapons, but didn't actually help defend them. So if Ukraine had nukes, then this invasion probably wouldn't have happened, because they could have nuked Russia. You have this mutually assured destruction, but only because of this agreement where Russia basically promised, and the United States and Great Britain promised to protect Ukraine, and therefore Ukraine gave up all of their nuclear weapons, were they susceptible to this attack. But let's move on to the next clip.
I think that's a good thing for the world. It would be horrible to think that the Ukraine would control nuclear weapons. And I think, unfortunately, with the leaders there and in Russia, bad things might have happened by now if they did. So that's a good thing. The next video actually is from
who's the former prime minister and president of Russia. He basically threatens to nuke Ukraine every other day. So it's not like that escalation is out of the picture, unfortunately. It's still a possibility. What were you going to say?
The next video is from 9 News. It's the retaliation by Ukraine against Russia, where they bombed out a big percentage of their aircraft.
This attack was codenamed Operation Spiderweb. It was 18 months in the planning, and drones were smuggled deep inside Russian territory. 117 were used, striking 41 of Russia's bomber fleet, which are capable of carrying cruise missiles. Ukraine estimates it to be about a third of Russia's entire fleet, causing around 11 billion Australian dollars worth of damage.
That's from 9 News out of Australia. Again, it's widely reported, and obviously that's a video that's pretty much gone viral, showing the actual attack on the Russian aircraft.
Yeah, I think the invention behind this is more notable. So just a few weeks when we discussed the Golden Dome, I had discussed something, and I mentioned it as a possible threat way before basically anybody was mentioning it. Do you want to give a summary of what that was?
Sure. So basically, as for those who know or don't know, there's a number of different systems that are in place in Israel to prevent attacks by ballistic and other missiles. And they have these different systems will each target different types of incoming warheads. And the United States has been, certainly President Trump specifically, has been saying, why don't we have something like that here? Why don't we have something to defend our homeland, similar to the technology that the United States helped bring forth in Israel? And whereas they have the Iron Dome there, of course, everything with Trump is covered in gold.
Golden.
I think he has some gold toilets over at some of his properties. So the United States would then be able to have, and now it's moving forward, that we are going to develop technology to have what we call the Golden Dome. And that is a missile defense system for the United States to protect us from incoming missiles. And the way I look at this is, you and I discussed it, and you brought up a few points regarding certain other ways that you could still circumvent something like that. But I think it's a deterrent more than anything else. It's not even, we know that in Israel, the technology works very well. It's far from perfect, but it really makes a huge difference. But it also is a deterrent. And I think a lot of times when they're lobbing missiles at Israel, they know that they aren't going to have, it's almost like they can get away with doing it because they know that they're probably are going to be defeated and everybody saves face. And the United States just wants to have, I think, some sort of system that would hopefully deter people from even trying to ever, because there's always been this talk, as I've brought it before. I grew up in Canada, and long before I even thought of moving to the United States and becoming a U.S. citizen, we used to always think during the time of the Cold War, we'd say, one time, what's going to happen is if the U.S. and Russia go to war, we're going to see the missiles flying over Canada in each direction. Hopefully none of them land in Canada. We'll be okay in the middle, but we're right in between. I think it's a smart thing to to use technology as a deterrent and then ultimately as a line of defense if the deterrence doesn't work.
Yeah, but specifically during that time, a lot of people were basically saying the Iron Dome or Golden Dome idea is basically irrelevant for the United States because the United States has the THAAD, which is a thermal high altitude defense, and they have the Patriot system, which is also good for long range missiles. But what the last thing the United States needs is an Iron Dome, which is for lobbing short range drones and missiles and mortars and rockets. And what I mentioned is that there could be this possibility where basically countries ship into United States ports a whole bunch of container ships filled with these drones, and suddenly these Shaheeds come shooting out, and suddenly, wait, maybe we should have developed this low-level defense like the Iron Dome itself, like that lower level of the Iron Dome. But back then, basically nobody was discussing this, and but now suddenly everybody is, because the way Ukraine conducted this attack was basically exactly that. They didn't ship it in over ships, they shipped it in over trucks. They may have actually been assembled within Russia, but the same parts that they order from China, and they build these FPV drones and then they attack these bombs, their range is very limited. So what they did is they put these in these pallets, in these containers, and they had regular Russian trucking companies ship these to areas not far from Air Force bases. And then they use these drones to completely destroy and obliterate probably about 41 heavy bombers. And Russia does not have the capability to manufacture these bombers. They've been out of production for decades. So anything that Russia loses, they lose completely because they can no longer use it. So this has been completely devastating for Russia. And it actually does make the United States a little bit safer, because a lot of these, like the Tu-95, are strategic long-range bombers that are designed to drop nuclear weapons on the United States. So by Ukraine defeating them and disrupting them, and since Russia cannot manufacture them any longer, it helps the United States in that resolve. It's not like Russia doesn't have other options to attack the United States, but at least this method of the triad, of the nuclear triad, has been lost to them almost. Noticeably, when you watch the video, you may notice that there were tires on the planes, and you'd be like, why are there tires on the planes? So most of these drones were flown by human pilots, but if they lost connection, they did have AI targeting. And Russia's idea was, if we cover the planes and the wings on the planes with tires to satellites and to AI, it may confuse them into thinking that this isn't a plane. But it didn't seem like that worked very much.
Yeah, again, technology aside, I think that's a fascinating thing. However, ultimately, to me, it's all about governments making decisions at the expense of people. There's time for war, but most of the time there isn't. I think, unfortunately, war is an example of failed everything else. You know what I'm saying? And sometimes you can't help it. Someone takes a hit at you, you hit them back. But I think we shouldn't trivialize and we shouldn't be excited about it. And I think that, unfortunately, what we see happening in Ukraine and Russia is just, at this point, what are they trying to accomplish, really? So
what this did show, though, is how vulnerable almost every country around the world is to these types of attacks that we had discussed a few weeks ago. And basically, aside from Israel, because they have the Iron Dome, no other country can defend even their airspace against these swarm drone attacks.
Yep, and that's why, again, the Golden Dome here, whatever technology we can use to, again, deter and then ultimately defend, that'd be great. Let's see how it all plays out. And ultimately, you have to understand behind the scenes really what's going on. Same thing, what's really going on with Russia and Ukraine. There's President Zelensky asking for money and endless amounts of money, and then admitting that billions are disappearing. He doesn't know where they are. Doesn't seem even concerned where they are. That's not my problem. I didn't get it, and I need more. To me, unfortunately, war is big business, and there are people and elites and so forth that benefit dramatically from war. All this equipment's being sold. Somebody's making money off of it, and there's a lot of players who don't want to see end to any war. They want more and more. And if you look at the history of the United States, we've been involved in endless wars, okay, just that have taken so many lives. And I think that it's good that we have a government now that really doesn't have an interest, our government, in being involved unless it absolutely has to. It doesn't want to be in other countries' wars. It doesn't want to be having any kind of war. And I think we can better use our resources, intelligence, and everything else to focus on other things. We'll see what happens. Unfortunately, there's bad players out there and things happen, but you take a step back and I could see the administration's frustration when you ask, what is Russia and what is the Ukraine actually trying to accomplish at this point?
So just to build on your point, in the past, so always wars are basically the leaders disagreeing. And like we saw with the wars in Europe, all the leaders were basically first cousins. World War I, World War II, they were all related to each other. And even mostly actually the wars beforehand, all these emperors were all basically first cousins of each other. And still they were fighting. So it was like, why don't you guys get in a room and discuss it, or pull out a sword and have a duel? So actually in ancient times, sometimes that would happen when these big battles would come, these huge militaries, and then they would say basically, hey, instead of having all of our soldiers, all of our men die, why don't we, the leaders, fight it out? And actually when this war in Ukraine started, basically Elon was like, hey, Putin, even though you have a background in not kung fu, but another one of these sports, is, hey, let's have a duel and for the future of Ukraine. It was just a funny jab. But sometimes it's, hey, why don't we let these leaders basically fight it out as leaders instead of sending their soldiers to die instead? So that would be nice.
Yeah, that's the same thing I have in medicine. If the prescribers or physicians had to do the tests or administer the treatments to themselves before they did to their patients, they probably wouldn't be administering as many drugs, and they'd find more creative, proper root cause medicine solutions than what they're doing. It's very easy to send people off to war, or to tell patients that they have to take a drug or do a treatment or get an organ excised from their body. But it would be a little different if you had to, before you remove my fill in the blank organ, you have to remove yours. When I see that in the going off to pathology, I'll send mine along with it. And that might make the surgeon decide not to do the surgery. I think the point with that is the decisions that are being made and the things that happen aren't always based on what we think they are. One of the areas we were discussing, which we can cover next, has to do with this push to release the files relating to the assassination of RFK, JFK, and Martin Luther King Jr. And there has been a large number of files released. I think, interestingly, as those are being analyzed and reviewed, it's one of these things where sometimes you don't want to admit the truth or know the truth. And we have a clip that I think does a very good job of explaining a narrative from someone that was actually involved at the time and spoke with the people that were investigating and has apparently the knowledge, unless he's making all this up. This answers a big part of the question as to why and how did JFK get assassinated, who did it and why. And I'm going to put up a little bit of it and then we can talk about it. But it just speaks to the behind the scenes clandestine things that are happening in all these governments. And if honestly it could happen in the United States, and I think a large percentage of Americans believe that there wasn't a single player, a single shooter. Oswald wasn't the only one that was a lone gunman that out of the blue just decided to go and do this assassination. Everybody's saying there's no way there was just one bullet and one shooter. But this story, for those who haven't heard it, I think is interesting. And again, it speaks to the nature of war and the nature of internal and external conflicts within countries and just what lengths people can go to in any country. Let me go ahead and put that up.
Okay, so I'd now like to bring in constitutional attorney, lawyer Daniel Sheehan, a civil rights lawyer with a great background running back 50 years, who spent a lot of time investigating the crimes of the CIA exposed during Watergate and the Church Commission. Danny, what comes out of your, I admit it would have to be a very brief analysis of the voluminous documents that have been revealed this week in the JFK documents archive? Have you been able to reach any conclusions?
I initially started going through them one at a time, and they're not identified. There's no designation of what the content of the document is. They just have these peculiar code that they're coded by.
That you've been very outspoken publicly previously about your view that JFK was the victim of a conspiracy, that essentially the president was murdered in a coup d'etat. And you think that there were people in the CIA who were principally responsible for that coup d'etat?
We interviewed Santos Trafficante, who put together the assassination team to kill Fidel Castro, which is when I first became involved in the professional investigation of this, as distinct from a hobby or some kind of avocation. I became professionally involved when I was one of the 3 trial lawyers in the office of Attorney F. Lee Bailey. Absolutely. He had been recruited early on, back when he was in the Marine Corps, in a thing called Operation Redskin. It was codenamed, to pretend that you're a Marxist and try to infiltrate. And this group was running Oswald. Oswald got recruited, and the whole purpose of Oswald was to take a shot at the caravan. He tried to make a phone call. He asked to have a phone call made out of the jail that night.
So obviously these are small pieces of this larger thing on News Nation, which you could go to joinnn.com to basically join this news organization and see this type of reporting. Ultimately, the story is this, right? So the United States basically wanted to get rid of Castro in Cuba. And they knew they couldn't do it directly. They couldn't just call for the assassination of another leader. So the CIA, which has, from most people's perspective, a mixed sort of not exactly clean hands approach to things, went and connected with people within the mob, Las Vegas, and talked to the mobsters and said, listen, you guys know how to make people disappear. We need to put together a group of people to make this happen. We need to get rid of the leader of Cuba. Because at the time, there was this big fear that Cuba, in connection with the USSR, which now is Russia, was planning on using their very close proximity, the 90-mile proximity to the United States, to launch an attack, and perhaps a nuclear attack on the United States. And during the Cold War, this was a real fear. There was a real belief. We came very close. To those that are too young to know, perhaps including yourself, this was like a real actual fear that we were going to be annihilated here in the United States. We might also take out parts of the USSR, but in the end, no one would win, just like we're seeing on a much smaller scale the Russian-Ukraine war, where again, no one wins in war. None of the people that are there living their lives are going to win. So ultimately, there was this real concern, a real belief, and they figured this was the only way we could do it. So they put together this team, according to this reporting.
Bay of Pigs invasion, was it?
I'm sorry?
Bay of Pigs invasion?
So the Bay of Pigs invasion was a horrible catastrophe and a failure. So essentially what happened was there were a number of different things that were attempted, and then they finally said, we have to do this. We're going to go and we're just going to take Castro out, and we're going to take Raul Castro out as well. So Fidel, Raul, we're going to take out the leadership and the family, and they're going to have to start anew, and this is going to open the door to a democratic Cuba. And that was the idea. However,
democratic just means good for American businesses, to be honest.
Whichever way you want to paint it, but bottom line, it's better than what it was for the people. But that was the idea. But the real interest was in defending the United States from what was happening, and that was that Cuba was a base of the USSR. And then things started changing, right? And we had JFK, which as a president, although he was a Democratic, left-leaning president, he was very centered. And what he wanted to do was use common sense and make the world a better place, basically. And all the people that seem to have that way of looking at things, including Martin Luther King Jr., they get assassinated because there's too many people that benefit from war and from chaos, right? So one of the things that was happening that's discussed in this particular story, so I encourage people to go and listen to it and then make their own opinions, is that JFK was speaking with the Russian leader, and they were talking about dismantling the nuclear warheads in both countries, just getting rid of them. Because we came to the brink of nuclear war with the USSR, and both countries realized this would potentially end the world and civilization as we know it. Because where would it stop? On the first, second, third, fourth nuclear warhead? So ultimately, they were coming to this agreement, and then there was even talk of a joint space program. So there were too many people looking at this going, oh no, that can't happen. We can't let these two leaders, those are enemies, those are communists. We can't let them possibly, there must be something wrong with our president if he's willing to work with him. There must be something wrong with our president if he's not fighting with him. And the team that was put together to service the needs of the CIA, per this story, that were going to go to Cuba and kill off Castro, when they were told by JFK to stand down, and then ultimately RFK as well, that this isn't something we're going to do, and they dismantled that entire operation, those individuals, apparently, that team continued to work independently of the CIA, independently of the government, and there must have been some people that knew this was still happening. They had a base here in Florida, and they apparently RFK actually sent helicopters, military helicopters, to bomb out or firebomb the location so that it couldn't keep operating. They're like, you guys can't be there. We're going to destroy the thing. And yet they still continued. And then that group viewed this as treason, that basically that JFK was acting in a treasonous manner. They didn't have the interest of the country, and he should be fighting Cuba, and he should be fighting Russia or USSR, and therefore he needs to be taken out. And they basically, the same team up for this story, went and they got Lee Harvey Oswald to be involved. They had all these connections that they set up so that he would have ties to Russia and ties to Cuba, so that when he was caught, they could then have an excuse to retaliate against these countries. So they just used him as a patsy to do this. And what he thought he was going to do was he was going there to just fire a bullet at the convoy, not actually kill the president. That's the story. And sure enough, it appears that his bullet hit the curb. He thought he did his job. He was going to leave. He was going to be arrested. Nothing was going to really happen to him because he was connected with the CIA. And it would give an excuse to go after the USSR and Cuba. And in the end, within seconds, there's all these other bullets ringing out. The president's been assassinated. He winds up getting stopped by the local police. He winds up shooting one of them and gets arrested. And in the end, the blame all falls on him. And that's the broader story, in that people...
So do you think he wasn't the person that assassinated the president?
Based on this story, which is an insider who's doesn't seem to have a bias either way. He's just trying to say what he knew, and he goes into great detail. That he didn't have an actual interest himself in actually doing that. He played a part of a role that he felt was important. He was trying to be patriotic in trying to do this assassination attempt so that the United States would then have a means, an excuse to retaliate against these other countries. Again, back to the whole notion of war and what's the basis of war and why are we at war? And from what he reports, he wasn't intending on actually doing that. And ultimately, bottom line is it wasn't his bullet ultimately. There were other bullets that rung out. And that's what's we hope comes to light. What this gentleman's saying is that there's been 60 years to delete, destroy, and remove any documents. They're hoping, Daniel Sheehan says, look, we'll maybe be lucky because nothing was computerized. It was all just typewritten things. Maybe there are documents we're going to find that no one knows still exist. But he says what's interesting is the documents themselves they're all being fed into AI right now so they can do searches because it's not in a computer system. Then they're searching for specific names, dates, and situations to see if they can pull up anything referencing it, because they have testimony. When people were arrested, when people were deposed, they have the pieces. And he describes this as basically a big puzzle. He says whether or not we ever get one smoking gun, pardon the pun, in any of these documents, if you understand the story and the testimonies that were given independently and are documented, and you put them together and you understand what was being attempted, then whatever's coming out will make more sense and it'll solidify the story. And again, nobody has wanted, no one in our government has really wanted to touch this. No one wants to bring to the surface as a possibility that our own government, the CIA, or any other branch of it, and he doesn't say that the CIA was actively doing this, but it's people that were originally set up by the CIA to assassinate the leader of Cuba, went rogue and decided to then ultimately do that to the president they felt had failed him. And I think if you look in more recent history, you can see what happens when people feel that a current president isn't doing the job they think needs to be done. Trump has been called a Nazi, has been called a traitor, has been called all kinds of things, just insane statements.
To be honest, this whole JFK story seems eerily resemblant to the Butler shooting, which we won't go too in depth here, but the official narrative there just really doesn't add up, and it does seem to mirror almost the assassination story of JFK. And to JFK's credit, we should definitely say that he was very level-headed, and basically his entire military and clandestine leadership were extremely hawkish, and they were just like, war, nuke. And he was just like, hey, guys, let's try and have a direct phone call. And they were like, what? You're going to talk to the enemy directly? How dare you? So really, kudos to him for really standing up to that. And thankfully, he was able to cause the USSR to back off of Cuba without nukes and de-escalate the situation. And that does show that de-escalation is possible, especially in situations where mutually assured destruction is basically going to hurt both sides. But yeah, really respect to JFK for that. And look, it cost him his life. So
him
and his brother,
Bobby Kennedy, and again, I think in the same realm, Martin Luther King Jr.,
Martin Luther King Jr. was a real hero, I got to say.
Was the person who would have brought forth really the changes that were needed much faster because of the way he was doing it. Okay. And Nobody wanted that. People were scared that he would actually succeed. And again, there's a theme to all this, right? So these leaders that are trying to be moderate, trying to avoid war, trying to figure out a way to deal with everyone, to bring two potentially opposing sides together. There's too many players and there's too much behind the scenes that have no interest in that. And I would tell you, when you hear of things like the deep state and all this, Bobby Kennedy was the guy who really understood that. And he spoke about it. He knew there were people within the government who felt that they controlled the government. And ultimately, one of the things mentioned in this particular talk was how we've had people that, again, have brought up and said, until you remove this deep state element, the president doesn't really control the country. There's too many other powers moving things along. And an example of that, look what's happening in our streets right now. Okay. We have a president that was put in place by an overwhelming majority, both the popular vote and, of course, the Electoral College. And one of the things had to do with border protection and fixing. We have some 20 million people, largely unvetted, who are in our country. Okay. We have more people.
Just under the past administration, it was 20 million. Right. Beforehand, there were another 20 million. So it's probably 40 million.
Sure. But I'm saying, at least in the last few years, we have like about 20 million people. That's larger than the population of many countries that are, we don't know who they are, why they're here. Ultimately, that's the issue. It's not that they wanted to be here. It's that we let them in without asking why. Typically, when someone knocks on your front door, before you let them in, you try to have a better understanding of who you're letting into your house. So now, no surprise, one of the things that was said that would happen, is happening, is people are being arrested and deported. They're being detained and reported. And our streets have essentially riots happening all over. We have a few clips regarding this. In fact, one of them, they're tied together here, just to give a taste of kind of the things that have been happening the last few days across the country. Los Angeles, there's, I believe, Minneapolis or New York, different states. People attacking federal buildings, people attacking federal agents for doing their jobs. Okay,
That's the thing. Under the Biden administration, these, especially ICE, they were tasked at helping the invasion of America. They were literally, the Border Patrol was forced to stand there and hold the gate open so that illegal migrants can literally just flow in unabattedly with no issues, no harassment, no problems whatsoever. So instead of trying to stop invaders trying to invade our country, they were tasked to help invaders to invade our country. And finally, under the current administration, they're actually doing their job. And in some of these places, some of these radical people in these places have really gone off their deep end because their world is upside down. And in their mind, doing the right thing is wrong and doing the wrong thing is right.
I think it's a misguided narrative. Okay. And I lived on the Mexican border for over a decade. And what's interesting is, at the time, initially, there was no one, I was there when Trump announced that he was running for his first presidency. And there were no Trump supporters there, none. There were protesters when his plane landed at the airport. There was no support. The last elections, that entire area, despite being almost entirely Democrat Party electorate, they voted overwhelmingly for Trump, overwhelmingly. And the reason is that people were fed up. This isn't about humanitarian, friendliness, letting people come across the border. The people that are living in that area are largely Mexican descent, and they were over it. They're like, people are just flowing in here. We don't know what's going on. Our towns are being ruined. We can't find jobs. The reality is the narrative on the national news didn't match the narrative on the street in places like Laredo, places like Harlingen, places like McAllen, places like Brownsville. That was not the narrative towards the end. And that's why really overwhelmingly the votes shifted towards President Trump in those areas. And it's just, people want some semblance of security, and this wasn't happening. So much of what we're seeing now, the blame isn't President Trump. The blame was because if you let a few 100,000 people in, maybe no one would notice. If you let tens of millions of people in, and it's wreaking havoc. Oh, and then you put them up in 5-star hotels, and you give them this and that, and you're flying them all over the country. You're waiting in line at the airport for an hour, and you have a special line right next to you that says they can just go right in front of you with no ID or anything, just a piece of printed paper on a computer, and they can board that airplane. I think people had enough. Okay, anyone that says anything otherwise is being misinformed or disingenuous. People were just had enough of this. And so this right now that's happening in the streets, as far as the detentions and the apprehensions, This is a result of the prior Biden administration. That's all. This is trying to correct some of it. We're not going to round up 20 million people, but we're going to try to get as many as we can. And again, they're focusing on the people that really have to leave the country because they have warrants and so forth. And this narrative that they're going after everybody is a little bit exaggerated. But
it's important to remember, though, that the Mexican cartels used to be extremely powerful on the southern side of the border. And then they started to become powerful on the northern side of the border because, like we said, if somebody comes and they don't have money, they'll help them smuggle them in, and then they'll just blackmail them and basically squeeze money out of them for the rest of their lives, turning them to indentured servitude, slaves, basically. And then these cartels started expanding into the entire United States and specifically focusing like the Midwest. A lot of drugs have been recently caught, the whole area, Wyoming, Montana, all the way around there. But really, the entire nation, cartels have been active until finally the new administration came in and started to put an end to it. So it is about time. But let's take a look at this clip that we have from the LAPD unwilling to assist ICE in its tasks, and we've recently even saw that I think this escalated further, and Trump said he'd send in the National Guard or something like that. So let's take a quick look.
Yeah, so this clip actually has several different clips put together. So one of them is in the LA area.
I'm here. You could have stopped that.
How did you know this was happening?
Reddit.
And, like I said many times, these elected officials or these non-government organizations, they can't cross the line either. I mean, we got people like, Hakeem Jeffries saying he's going to dox ICE employees, ICE agents out there with masks on. They're wearing masks to protect themselves and their families because they've been doxxed, their families been doxxed, their life's been threatened, their families have been threatened.
And one of the things I find disappointing, but not surprising, so like in Los Angeles, you do see some law enforcement standing there literally doing next to nothing. And essentially, one of the things that was reported was that when federal buildings became essentially under attack, where now they were throwing explosives at the buildings and throwing things at it and throwing things at the agents, they couldn't get LAPD to come out. Los Angeles police wasn't even coming out until the end, until much later, until they figured, okay, we can't wait any longer, let's come out. So local law enforcement in some of these localities are saying, we have nothing to do with this.
They're working with the terrorists instead of with the federal government.
This is mayhem in the streets. They have to stop it. It's no different than happened during the BLM riots. Sure. It's exactly the same. And unfortunately, police leadership decides what the police department will do. And if it's a local police department, it's typically run by the city commission and the mayor. Okay. And if it's a sheriff's office, it's up to the sheriff's point of view and what they really want to enforce. And look, bottom line is this shouldn't be happening in our streets. No matter what you think, you could stand there with flags and signs and do whatever. To be throwing, and by the way, if someone's damaging federal equipment, guess who's going to pay for it to be replaced? The taxpayer.
Taxpayers, yeah.
Because that's you and me, all of us. Okay, that's just an abomination. So yeah, so President Trump at this point has signed to have 2,000 National Guardsmen sent to these various locations. So again, New York, I think. If you saw there was Minneapolis, I'm not sure if that's one of the locations, but I know California definitely, to just calm this down and stop it as a deterrent. This can happen. And Tom Homan, one of the things he did say in one of the interviews, he says, look, people need to get this. Someone's going to get hurt. It's either going to be someone on the law enforcement side or it's going to be someone in the public, neither of which should be put in these positions. This shouldn't be happening. And there's someone instigating this. You saw that guy say, I found out about this on Reddit. So people are saying, hey, go out, do whatever, do this. They're being instigated. They're being told what to do. And they're going out and doing it. And things get out of hand when you have a big crowd and a mob. And do they really think they're going to stop anything? They're not going to. None of this is going to change anything. It's that it'll stir the pot. It'll create mayhem. And there are people that's what they want.
I just want Add a note in terms of stoning cars. Here it was police vehicles, so they may be slightly more protected. But in Israel, terrorists have been stoning cars for decades now with sometimes humongous boulders. And they'll stand on a high point and they'll just throw it at civilian cars, not at police there. Also at police, but specifically at civilian cars. And hundreds of innocent people have been killed because they try and swerve away and the car rolls over, or they get into a car accident, or they're hit by the stone and that injures or kills them. Literally hundreds of people have been killed. So this is a terror tactic that terrorists have been using for a very long time. And it's unfortunately like a pastime sport in many parts of the Palestinian Authority, but it is extremely dangerous and can cost the lives of hundreds of people. So it's no game throwing stones at cars.
It was being done here. When I moved to Florida, that was a thing. It was a gang initiation tactic. They had to murder people, okay, that they were required to murder people to get full membership in the gang. And they had to do these things. And it wasn't until, I believe it was Jeb Bush at the time that was the governor, said, that's it, zero tolerance. If you even look like, we're going to profile everybody in anything. If you even look like you have a gang tattoo or whatever, we're stopping you. And people were like screaming, oh, whatever. But the public said, no, please do that. We don't care. We can't live this way anymore. Because cars were driving under underpasses and rocks, bricks were going through people's windshields. After, I think, the third or fourth time that happened here in Florida, everyone said, that's it. We don't care. Whatever you need to do it. Kick in doors, arrest people, figure it out later. And they did. It took that level, and that's the reality. We had that happen in Florida, and it ended. It all stopped. They arrested all the people. There was an international incident where there was a murder of a German couple, so it became an international scandal.
Oh, wow.
All this had to do with gangs here operating in Florida. And they got dismantled.
Profiling does work, like we saw with El Salvador. In one day, he rounded up 70,000 by profiling them based on tattoos, based on affiliations. Israel gets blamed for profiling people too, but you know what? Ben Gurion is considered the safest airport in the world specifically because they do that, because it is effective. And again, if they examine you and you aren't at fault, they let you go and you're sorry for the delay. We apologize that you were questioned for an hour, but it does make the airport the safest airport in the world. And like we saw with El Salvador, it literally cleaned up the streets and turned it from the most dangerous country in the world to the safest one in the world. So yeah, it is effective. And when it is needed, it should be used. And yeah, let's move on to the next story.
The same theme of what's going on behind the scenes and what government's deciding. This is the next topic has to do with something that I love talking about. It has to do with health and wellness and basically how to not be sick. And
be sure to watch part 2 of episode 14 and our